The morning sun pierced through the thick woods, casting long shadows that stretched across the dew-covered grass. In the heart of the forest, a small bobcat kitten, barely a few weeks old, stirred in the tall ferns where its mother had left it. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and wet earth, and the world felt eerily quiet, save for the faint sounds of rustling leaves. At first glance, the kitten appeared to be sleeping soundly, nestled deep within the underbrush. Its small body, covered in soft fur, blended seamlessly with the natural surroundings. But the truth was far from peaceful. The bobcat kitten, who had just opened its eyes to the world, was alone. The mother's protective gaze had momentarily strayed, and in that split second of distraction, a tragedy struck. A loud crack echoed through the trees as a nearby hunter's trap snapped shut, its cruel jaws catching the mother bobcat. She had been so close, too close to escape its deadly grip. Despite her strength and will to fight, the trap was unforgiving, and she was rendered motionless. The kitten had no idea of the danger. For the first few moments, it lay there in the safety of the ferns, watching the world with innocent eyes, unaware that everything had just changed. It didn't hear the sharp thud of its mother's fall, nor did it sense the growing emptiness in the air. But when the hours passed and the warmth of its mother's presence failed to return, the kitten began to feel the panic creeping in. The little creature's heart raced as the sky shifted from a golden hue to deep, dark shades of blue. Where was she? The bobcat kitten's tiny legs trembled with unease, and its throat cried out in a small, desperate yowl. Silence! The forest seemed indifferent to its cries. It was not long before the first nightfall arrived, and with it, the chilling reminder of how fragile life could be in the wild. Alone, scared, and vulnerable, the kitten was left to navigate a hostile world without its mother's protective gaze. And despite its tiny size, it was forced to learn quickly what survival meant. As the days dragged on, the kitten faced a haunting realization that the world it had been born into was a dangerous place. Every shadow felt menacing, every rustling sound a potential threat. Its instincts kicked in, but with each failed attempt to hunt or find food, the small bobcat's will began to waver. It was becoming painfully clear that survival in the wild was no simple task, even for a creature designed by nature to be swift, agile, and fierce. However, hope arrived in the form of a quiet, determined presence. A woman named Sarah had always been a compassionate soul, especially when it came to animals. She had worked at the local wildlife rehabilitation center for years, caring for all sorts of creatures that had been injured, orphaned, or abandoned. But that particular morning, as she made her way through the woods on a routine hike, she had no idea that her life was about to take an unexpected turn. Sarah's sharp eyes caught a glimpse of movement in the bushes. Her first instinct was to ignore it, assuming it was just another common animal going about its daily business. But something in the stillness of the moment caught her attention, pulling her deeper into the woods, where she stumbled upon the small bobcat kitten, lying helplessly near the remnants of the trap. The sight of the young bobcat, its fur matted and its body covered in scratches, broke Sarah's heart. She crouched beside the trembling creature, her fingers brushing its fur as she assessed its condition. The kitten's eyes locked with hers, wide and fearful, but there was something more in that gaze, a glimmer of hope. The small creature had no words, but in that moment, it seemed to speak volumes, pleading for someone, anyone, to step in. Sarah gently scooped the kitten into her arms, cradling it against her chest. Its tiny body stiffened for a moment, unsure of whether to trust this stranger. But as Sarah whispered soothing words, the kitten began to relax, sensing the warmth and comfort that came from the woman's touch. With a deep breath, Sarah stood up, determination written across her face. She knew that she couldn't just leave this kitten to fend for itself in the harsh wilderness. Its chances were slim without its mother, and the trap was just one of many dangers the kitten would face. She was its only hope now. Carefully, Sarah made her way back through the woods, the tiny bobcat in her arms, her heart heavy with the responsibility she had just taken on. The forest felt like a distant memory, its beauty now overshadowed by the urgency of her mission. The path ahead would not be easy. In the world of wildlife rehabilitation, every day was a battle for survival, and the road to recovery was long and filled with obstacles. But Sarah refused to back down. As she moved through the forest, her thoughts were consumed by the fragility of life. The Bobcat Kitten's story was just one of many she had seen over the years, but there was something different about this one. The connection she felt with the kitten was undeniable, and the resolve to give it a fighting chance burned fiercely inside her. This was just the beginning of a journey that would test Sarah's strength, compassion, and her understanding of what it truly meant to love and protect. But for now, all that mattered was that she had given the kitten a chance. It was a small act, but in the vastness of the wild, it was enough. The first few days after Sarah rescued the Bobcat Kitten were nothing short of exhausting. The small creature, still trembling from its terrifying ordeal, had refused to eat or drink, its tiny body weak and fragile. Sarah, a seasoned wildlife rehabilitator, had seen her share of injured animals. But this was different. There was something about the kitten's helplessness that tugged at her heartstrings in a way she hadn't expected. She set up a warm, cozy space in the rehabilitation center's back room, away from the other animals. It was quiet, dimly lit, with soft bedding where the kitten could rest. Sarah stayed close, talking to it softly, offering food and water whenever she could. The kitten remained still for most of the first day, its large eyes watching her, filled with a mixture of fear and confusion. It was as though it couldn't quite decide if it should trust her, or if it was simply too tired to care. Sarah's life had always been dedicated to helping animals, yet this kitten was different. She wasn't sure if it was because it was so young, so innocent, or if it was the overwhelming sense of loss that seemed to emanate from the tiny creature. In its eyes, Sarah saw a reflection of her own struggle, a desire to heal, to overcome hardship, but also a deep sense of vulnerability. She knew that the bond she was forming with this kitten was more than just a rehabilitation process. It felt personal. It felt like something she was meant to do. Days passed, and slowly but surely, the kitten began to show signs of improvement. Its trembling subsided, and it started to eat, albeit in small bites. Sarah was thrilled to see these tiny steps toward recovery, but she also knew there was a long road ahead. In her quiet moments, when she wasn't tending to the kitten, Sarah found herself thinking about the life this young bobcat would never know. It would never grow up in the wild, learning to hunt and explore, as its mother had done. Its path had been irrevocably altered by the trap that had claimed its mother. The kitten would be forever dependent on humans for survival, an existence that Sarah knew was not ideal. She had witnessed firsthand the deep connection animals had with the land, their natural habitats, and their instincts. The wild was where they truly belonged. But what choice did they have? The world they lived in was becoming less forgiving, with urban sprawl encroaching on once pristine lands, and traps and dangers lurking at every corner. The kitten's fate was now intertwined with Sarah's mission. She had to help it, no matter the cost. As the days passed, Sarah noticed the kitten becoming more curious. It began to explore its new environment, though it was still skittish. It would jump at the slightest sound, its ears twitching nervously. The world was no longer the comforting haven it had once been for the kitten. It had learned, too early, the dangers lurking within it. One afternoon, Sarah decided to let the kitten out of its enclosure for the first time. She'd been giving it space to heal, but she knew it was time for the next step. She opened the small door to the room, and the kitten, initially hesitant, stepped out. The floor beneath it was smooth and unfamiliar, but as it pattered around, it stopped to sniff at every corner. It was clear that the kitten had inherited the sharp senses of its species. The way it moved, stealthy and calculated, was a sign that its instincts were still intact. Sarah watched the kitten closely, her heart swelling with pride. It had come so far in such a short time, and yet there was so much more to be done. She knew that the kitten wasn't just recovering physically. It was beginning to trust again. It was learning to survive, not just in the wilderness, but in a world that was not its own. And that trust, however fragile, was a key to its future. As Sarah observed the kitten, she couldn't help but think about the relationship she had with animals. She had always felt a deep connection with them, even from a young age. Growing up in a rural town, she had spent much of her time outside, caring for the family's pets and helping injured animals. Her love for wildlife was something that had shaped her identity, and it was that same love that drove her to open the rehabilitation center years ago. The work was demanding and emotionally draining. There were successes, yes, but there were also moments of heartache when animals didn't survive. Every loss felt like a personal failure, but Sarah had learned to cope with it. It was a part of the process. The ultimate goal was always to give these animals a chance, even if it was a fleeting one. But the bobcat kitten, this one felt different. This one felt like more than just a patient. It felt like a second chance for both of them. As the days stretched on, Sarah's bond with the kitten deepened. She started to give it a name, though she wasn't sure why. It felt silly to name an animal that might never return to the wild, but the name seemed to solidify the connection between them, something that made the relationship feel more real. She called it Shadow, a reflection of the kitten's cautious nature, always lurking in the background, careful not to trust too quickly. Shadow began to open up to Sarah in small ways. It would follow her around the room, its little paws patting softly across the floor. It no longer flinched at Sarah's touch, and on occasion, when Sarah sat down on the floor, the kitten would climb into her lap, curling up into a ball and nuzzling her hands. These moments of closeness were a reminder of how far they had both come. Yet, there was still an unspoken understanding between them. Shadow was not entirely hers to keep. There would come a time when the kitten would have to face the wild again, whether it was ready or not. But Sarah wasn't sure if it ever truly could be ready. The world it was meant for had already begun to slip through its pores. Would Shadow ever be able to adjust? Or had the human world already changed it forever? The days grew longer as summer encroached upon the forest, and with each passing moment, Sarah felt the growing weight of the decision that loomed over her. When should she let Shadow go? The kitten had come so far, and Sarah had done everything she could to nurse it back to health. But she also knew the brutal truth that no matter how much love and care she could offer, the wild was its true home. The world outside the rehabilitation center, with its dangers and promises of freedom, would soon be waiting for Shadow. But Shadow wasn't ready. For all the progress it had made, the kitten still seemed out of place. It wasn't just a fear, it was something deeper, a loss of connection with its roots. The spark that should have been there, the primal instincts that would guide it through the wild, had dimmed. Shadow no longer had the mother who would have taught it to hunt or defend itself. In its place, it had Sarah, human, fragile, loving, and protective. While Sarah had been a constant source of comfort, she was no replacement for what Shadow had lost. One late afternoon, Sarah decided to take a step that she'd been reluctant to make for weeks. She wanted to see how far Shadow had come, see if the kitten's instincts had returned enough to navigate the outdoors once more. Sarah opened the door of the rehabilitation center and set Shadow down on the soft grass. The moment Shadow stepped out, the kitten froze. The world beyond the walls of the center was vast, overwhelming even. The tall trees loomed above, their leaves whispering in the wind. The scent of the forest filled the air, a blend of fresh earth and pine. Shadows stretched across the ground as the late afternoon sun cast long beams of light through the trees. For a long while, Shadow stood there, motionless, eyes wide with uncertainty. It wasn't the way Sarah had imagined this moment would unfold. She had expected curiosity, perhaps even excitement. But the kitten seemed more fearful than anything else. It darted behind Sarah's legs, hiding in the shade as it peeked out with trembling eyes. Sarah's heart ached as she knelt beside the kitten. "It's okay," she whispered, brushing a stray tuft of fur from Shadow's face. "You can do this." But Shadow wasn't so sure. It looked up at Sarah, its eyes filled with a mixture of trust and terror, as though it couldn't decide whether to follow her lead or retreat into the safety of the familiar. In the coming days, Sarah tried again and again to ease Shadow into the outside world. They spent hours together, walking through the woods, climbing hills, and venturing to nearby streams. But the kitten remained skittish, reluctant to venture too far from the center. Whenever a bird fluttered by or a twig snapped in the distance, Shadow would startle, its tiny body trembling in fear. Each time, Sarah would kneel down, offering comfort and reassurance, but it was clear that the kitten was still not ready. The wild, with all its vastness and unpredictability, had become an enemy. Shadow no longer knew how to fit into a world that demanded survival at every turn. And as the days passed, a new complication arose. Word had spread through the local community about the rescue of a baby bobcat, and soon, Sarah began receiving calls from concerned locals. Some feared the kitten's presence would lead to trouble. Others simply wanted to know what would happen to the animal. It wasn't long before Sarah received an unexpected visit from a wildlife officer. The officer, a stern man named Chris, stood in the doorway of the rehabilitation center, arms crossed over his chest. He had the air of someone who had seen too much of the darker side of nature, and his expression was hard to read. "I heard you've got a bobcat kitten here," he said gruffly, "and I'm afraid that's a problem." Sarah didn't hesitate. "What do you mean?" Chris stepped into the room, glancing around. "The kitten isn't a pet, Sarah. It's a wild animal. Keeping it here, even temporarily, is a violation of the law. You've had it for weeks now, and I'm afraid it's time for you to let it go." The word stung. Sarah's chest tightened, a lump forming in her throat. "I've been doing everything I can to help it. It's not ready. I can't just—" "I get it. You've got a good heart," Chris interrupted, his tone softening slightly. "But you can't keep it forever. It needs to learn how to fend for itself, and that's not going to happen if you keep babying it." Sarah looked down at Shadow, who had curled up on its favorite blanket, eyes half closed in exhaustion. It was clear that it still needed help, that it was far from ready to face the dangers of the forest alone. "I don't know if it ever will be," Sarah said quietly. Chris's gaze softened. "You're not doing it any favors by sheltering it. You're giving it a false sense of security. It won't survive in the wild if you don't help it become wild again." The conversation lingered in the air long after Chris left. His words echoed in Sarah's mind as she sat beside Shadow that evening, watching the kitten curl into a ball, its breathing slow and steady. Sarah had always known that the day would come when she would have to let Shadow go, but it was becoming harder than she'd ever imagined. The tension between what was right for Shadow and what was comfortable for Sarah grew unbearable. She had become so attached to the kitten that the thought of releasing it into the wild seemed like a betrayal. But she also knew that keeping Shadow in captivity would only prolong its suffering, that it would never thrive in a world where humans were its only source of safety. As Sarah lay awake that night, the weight of the decision pressed down on her. She thought of the forest, the place where Shadow truly belonged, and the mother that the kitten would never know. The wild had taken everything from this small creature, and it was up to Sarah to give it back. But how could she say goodbye? The morning air was crisp and cool, with just a hint of autumn's approach. Sarah stood at the edge of the forest, watching the mist rise from the valley below. It was a peaceful scene, but for her, the stillness was deafening. She had spent the entire night weighing the decision, wrestling with the harsh reality that was now unavoidable. Shadow's fate was no longer in her hands, but the pain of letting go felt like an unbearable weight on her chest. Shadow had grown stronger in the last few weeks. It had become more confident in its steps, its muscles more defined as it played in the open space Sarah had created for it. But the truth was clear. The kitten was still trapped in a limbo between two worlds. While Sarah had been a steady presence, offering food, comfort, and safety, Shadow's instincts, those vital skills needed for survival in the wild, had not fully returned. Every time it ventured further from Sarah, it would hesitate, unsure of what to do next. The day before, Sarah had taken Shadow to the woods again. This time, she had let the kitten roam free without the usual restraints. Shadow had cautiously sniffed the air, eyes wide, ears flicking at every new sound. It had moved in slow, calculated steps, but the fear was palpable. When a small rabbit dashed by, Shadow froze, its body stiff with indecision. Should it chase? Should it run? The moment passed, and Shadow retreated to Sarah's side, seeking comfort in her presence. It wasn't a hunt. It was a reminder of everything the kitten had lost, and everything it still hadn't gained. Now, as Sarah stood at the forest's edge, she could feel that familiar tug of affection for the kitten, the one that kept her from seeing the larger picture. But she knew that if she didn't let Shadow go, it might never become the bobcat it was meant to be. She couldn't protect it forever. It was time. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "You ready?" Sarah turned to see Emma, her niece, standing behind her. Emma was a young woman, bright-eyed and full of energy, but there was a seriousness in her expression now. She had grown attached to Shadow as well, often spending her afternoons at the center, helping Sarah care for the kitten. Emma had watched the animal's journey from the very beginning, from the fragile, trembling creature to the stronger, more curious bobcat that it had become. But even Emma knew that it was time for the kitten to find its way in the world. "I don't know if I can do this," Sarah admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "It feels like I'm betraying it." Emma stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on her aunt's shoulder. "You're not betraying it. You're giving it what it needs, the chance to survive, to be free. That's more than anyone else would do." Sarah took a deep breath, nodding, but the fear remained. The fear of watching Shadow disappear into the unknown, not knowing what would happen next. There was no guarantee the kitten would survive on its own. The forest was full of predators, other animals that wouldn't hesitate to take advantage of an unprotected young bobcat. It had already lost its mother, and there was no way of knowing if it would find a place for itself in this vast, unforgiving world. But Sarah knew she had no other choice. Shadow needed this. She couldn't keep it in a cage of safety forever, even if it broke her heart to let it go. She wasn't just setting Shadow free. She was giving the kitten the greatest gift she could offer, the chance to live its own life on its own terms. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the door to the small enclosure where Shadow had been staying. The kitten was resting on its blanket, eyes half closed, looking content in its comfortable surroundings. But as Sarah stepped closer, Shadow's ears perked up. The kitten's head lifted, its eyes meeting Sarah's with a quiet understanding. It knew something was different about this moment. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked softly, kneeling beside the kitten. For a moment, Shadow simply stared at her, as if contemplating the enormity of the decision. Then, as if making up its mind, the kitten stood up, stretching its small limbs. Its fur glistened in the morning light as it took a tentative step forward. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she reached out, gently stroking Shadow's fur one last time. The kitten nuzzled her hand, and Sarah fought back the tears that threatened to spill over. "Goodbye, Shadow," she whispered. "Be strong." Emma stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "You've done everything you could. You've given it a chance." With that, Sarah opened the door wide, and for the first time in weeks, the world beyond the walls of the rehabilitation center lay open before Shadow. The kitten paused at the threshold, looking back at Sarah one last time, before it padded into the tall grass, disappearing into the forest. Sarah stood there, unable to move, her eyes fixed on the spot where Shadow had vanished. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the finality of it sinking in. But deep down, she knew it was the right choice. The forest had taken from Shadow, but it had also given back. This was a path forward, the only path that could lead to a future. Hours passed, and Sarah found herself walking along the same trail where she had released Shadow, her heart heavy but somehow lighter at the same time. The world around her seemed to shift, the air feeling fresher, more alive. She had done the right thing. The wild, once a place of fear, now felt more like a friend, one that would nurture and guide Shadow through the next chapter of its life. Later that evening, Sarah sat on the porch of her home, watching the sunset. The sky was ablaze with vibrant oranges and reds, casting long shadows across the land. As she sat in the silence, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from Emma. "Shadows out there, Aunt Sarah. It's going to be okay." A small smile tugged at the corner of Sarah's lips. She didn't need to see Shadow to know it was out there, living its life as it should be. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt peace. Days passed, and the seasons began to shift. The air grew colder, the trees shedding their golden leaves in preparation for the coming winter. Sarah's mornings were spent in the rehabilitation center, tending to other animals that had been brought in, but her mind was never far from Shadow. It had been almost a week since she had let the little bobcat go, and though she had tried to move on, the sense of loss lingered, like a faint echo of something once cherished. It wasn't easy, but she had come to understand that this was a way of things. It was a cycle of life. After all, animals came and went, some flourishing in the wild, others failing to make it. Shadow's story was not over. It was only just beginning. And though Sarah could never truly know how the kitten was faring out there in the vastness of the forest, she carried with her a quiet sense of peace, knowing that she had done what was best for the little creature. But even that peace was not without its moments of doubt. One evening, as Sarah walked along the same trail she had taken when she first released Shadow, she paused near the edge of the forest. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of purple and pink. The cool breeze rustled the branches of the trees, but there was a stillness that seemed to settle over the land. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It was then that she heard a sound, soft, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable, a rustling in the underbrush. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the noise, her eyes straining to see through the growing darkness. And then, there it was, a flash of movement, small but unmistakable, Shadow emerging from the shadows of the forest. The kitten's fur was a bit matted, its body slightly thinner than Sarah remembered, but its eyes were bright, filled with life and purpose. It was no longer the fragile creature Sarah had rescued from the trap. It had become something stronger, something wilder. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched Shadow move toward her. It was as if the kitten had been waiting for this moment as much as she had. A moment of reunion, but more than that, a moment of understanding. Shadow paused a few feet away, its eyes locking with Sarah's. There was no fear now, no hesitation. The kitten didn't need to be coaxed or comforted. It was at home here, in the wild, in the place where it belonged. But even as it stood there, looking up at Sarah, there was something else in its gaze, a gratitude, a quiet acknowledgement that this bond between them was something neither time nor distance could erase. Sarah took a cautious step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't reach out for the kitten. She simply stood there, watching, waiting. And in that moment, Shadow took a step closer, its soft paws making no sound on the forest floor. Without a word, Sarah crouched down, her hands resting on her knees, and she watched as Shadow moved past her, not looking back but clearly aware of her presence. It was a silent goodbye, one that spoke volumes without a single word being uttered. This was not a farewell of sorrow or regret, but one of understanding, a recognition that the kitten was no longer hers to protect. It had found its place in the world, a world that was both vast and unforgiving, but also beautiful and full of potential. As Shadow disappeared into the forest, Sarah felt a sense of closure, one that she hadn't known she needed. The quiet pain of letting go had been replaced with something else. Pride. Pride that she had been able to give Shadow the chance to live, to thrive, and to find its way. The wild had claimed it, and in return, Shadow had given Sarah something priceless, an understanding of what true love and sacrifice meant. Sarah stood up slowly, wiping a tear from her cheek. She wasn't sad. She wasn't heartbroken. She was grateful. Grateful for the time she had spent with the kitten, for the lessons learned, and for the reminder that love wasn't always about holding on. Sometimes, love meant letting go. The path back to the rehabilitation center felt different now. The weight of the world seemed a little lighter, the air a little fresher. The forest, with all its dangers and mysteries, no longer seemed like a place of uncertainty. It was a place of possibility. And in her heart, Sarah knew that Shadow would be just fine. It had found its way. Later that evening, as Sarah sat in her kitchen, a warm cup of tea in her hands, her phone buzzed again. It was another message from Emma. "I saw Shadow today. It's doing great. You did the right thing, Aunt Sarah." The smile that spread across Sarah's face was genuine, one that reached her eyes and warmed her heart. She had done the right thing. Shadow had a future, one that was no longer defined by the past or the safety of captivity. It had a chance to live freely, to grow, and to thrive. And in that quiet moment, as Sarah looked out the window at the stars beginning to twinkle in the night sky, she knew that Shadow would always carry a part of her with it, a part of the love, the sacrifice, and the hope that she had given, no matter how far the kitten roamed. As Sarah sat back in her chair, the peaceful warmth of the evening wrapping around her like a soft blanket, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her here. It hadn't been an easy road. There had been moments of doubt, moments when the weight of the world felt unbearable. But despite all the challenges, the love she had for that small, resilient bobcat kitten had never wavered. And it was that love that had guided her every step of the way. The journey was far from over. There were always more animals in need, more stories to be written, and more lives to change. Sarah knew that. As a wildlife rehabilitator, she had dedicated her life to giving animals a fighting chance, to showing them that even in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving, there was still hope. There was still love. There was still the possibility for a second chance. And that, perhaps, was the most powerful message of all. As Sarah looked out at the forest one final time, she realized that the story of Shadow was just one of many stories she would tell. Stories of survival, of compassion, of the wild and the wondrous. She had been a part of something bigger, something that transcended the boundaries of species or circumstances. She had been a part of nature's grand, intricate design, one where the smallest acts of kindness could have the greatest ripple effects. And now, she wanted to share that story with all of you. For all the animal lovers, the people who believe in second chances, and for those who understand the profound bond between humans and animals, Sarah's story is a testament to what's possible when we come together to protect and care for the creatures that share our world. It's about the importance of compassion, the power of hope, and the willingness to let go when the time is right. But Sarah's story, and Shadow's, isn't over. You can help make a difference in the lives of animals just like the bobcat kitten. Every little action counts. And whether it's through supporting your local wildlife rehabilitation centers, volunteering, or donating, your involvement can help create a brighter future for those who cannot speak for themselves. If this story has moved you, if you believe in the power of second chances, then I encourage you to take a moment and reflect on the impact you can make. Share this video with your friends and family, spread the word, and let others know that it's possible to make a real difference in the world. Together, we can help change the lives of countless animals in need. So, don't just sit back and let these stories pass by. Like, share, and subscribe to this channel to be part of the movement that is changing the world one story at a time. Let's continue to spread hope, compassion, and the love of animals. Your support will help us bring more stories like Shadows to life, stories of survival, redemption, and the healing power of love. Remember, every small act of kindness can have a lasting impact. Whether it's helping an animal in need, donating to a cause you believe in, or simply spreading awareness about the importance of wildlife conservation, you can make a difference. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Sarah's story, Shadow's story, is a reminder that we all have the power to make the world a better place. Together, we can create a future where every creature has the opportunity to thrive, to be loved, and to live free. Please don't forget to like this video, share it with those who need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories like this one. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue to bring these important stories to life. And as always, thank you for being a part of this incredible journey. Let's keep the love and hope alive together.